All right, let's dive right into today's explainer. If you follow global geopolitics, you know the web surrounding the restart of the Iran conflict is incredibly complex. So today, we're cutting through all the noise. We're taking 50 pieces of deep dive analysis and boiling them down into one clear framework to map out exactly how this might end. The massive question hanging over everything right now is, how does this actually end? Based on the source data, there are 5 very distinct scenarios on the table. And to truly figure out where the global economy is heading, we need to leave political bias completely at the door and just follow the numbers. Here's our roadmap for today. We're covering the 5 paths, the diplomatic solutions, the frozen conflicts, the escalation nightmare, comparing the hard impacts on oil and stability, and finally, getting to the definitive verdict. Let's get into it.
Part 1. The 5 paths to the end. Looking at the probability breakdown, a really striking reality emerges right away. The extreme ends of the spectrum, like a clean, quick deal or a massive escalation, are actually the least likely, hovering down around 10 to 17%. Instead, it's the messy middle that completely dominates here. Low-intensity conflict and the frozen blockade are eating up the lion's share of the probabilities. We're heavily trending towards stagnation, not a swift resolution.
Part 2. The diplomatic solutions. Let's unpack Scenario 1, the quick diplomatic deal. Why is it sitting at such a low 10 to 15% chance? Well, it's a classic standoff. You've got the US saying, hand over the uranium, then we'll lift the sanctions. And Iran is saying, no way, give us the sanctions relief first, then we talk uranium. When your baseline demands are fundamentally mutually exclusive like that, a quick, clean deal is a massive long shot. Then we have Scenario 5, the negotiated partial settlement. This would involve capping enrichment, lifting some sanctions, and getting traffic flowing smoothly under supervision through the Strait of Hormuz. Sounds promising, right? But again, the data gives it only a 10 to 15% likelihood. The reality is, a partial settlement means nobody gets exactly what they want. Pulling it off requires immense mutual compromise and rare statesmanship, something our sources note is in very short supply right now.
Part 3. The frozen conflicts.
To make sense of Scenario 2, the prolonged low-intensity conflict, the sources draw this totally fascinating parallel to the Korean armistice. This scenario is the absolute heavyweight in our analysis at roughly 40%. Basically, imagine ceasefire cycles that just keep expiring, getting re-extended and repeating indefinitely. No formal peace treaty, no full-blown war, it just becomes permanent background noise. Why is it so highly probable? Simply because it requires the absolute least amount of political courage from anyone involved. Building right on top of that stagnation is Scenario 4, a frozen conflict with permanent blockade, carrying a solid 20 to 25% probability. Think of this as maximum pressure 2.0. The blockade becomes permanent, but the targeted side just adapts. They build out shadow fleets, pivot their trade to allies, and implement shipping tolls. It's not a hot war, but it sure isn't peace either. It's a structural state of permanent economic hostility, where one side fatigues, the other slowly rebuilds, and neither truly wins. Part 4. The escalation nightmare. Now, here is where things get really tense. The sources warn there is a 15 to 20% chance of Scenario 3, dramatic escalation. The data points squarely at a highly volatile window around mid-May to June. If those fragile ceasefire cycles we just talked about suddenly collapse, we enter Phase 2. That means expanded air campaigns and potential ground operations. And that inevitably triggers a massive retaliation phase. We're talking missiles hitting Gulf infrastructure, major cyber attacks going live, and proxy groups fully activating. It's the absolute nightmare scenario. Part 5. Comparing oil and stability. To really grasp what these scenarios mean for you and the global economy, we have to put their impacts head-to-head. And the swings here are wild. A quick deal drops oil prices to a nice, comfortable $70 to $80 a barrel, and the region stabilizers. But if we hit that dramatic escalation, oil spikes to $130 to $150, bringing a massive risk of a global recession and full regional war. Now let's look at the most likely paths, the low-intensity conflict and the permanent blockade. Those scenarios lock the globe into permanently elevated oil prices, right around $85 to $100. We'll be paying more at the pump while living in a constant state of structural hostility. Finally, Part 6, the final verdict. So, weighing all the probabilities and the massive economic impacts, how does this actually end? Well, the most likely path isn't just one isolated scenario. It's actually a slide. Scenario 2 slowly morphs into Scenario 4. First, ceasefire cycles continue indefinitely.
Then, those temporary blockades harden into a permanent structural reality. And finally, the world just adapts. The conflict doesn't end with a spectacular bang or some historic peace treaty. It simply fades into permanent background radiation within the global economy. And living with that background radiation, that's going to shape global politics for a generation. The era of cheap energy is over. Elevated oil prices become the permanent new normal. We're going to see international alliances weaken as countries try to navigate this massive gray zone. The global push for de-dollarization is going to heavily accelerate as nations look for workarounds to bypass structural blockades. And at the end of the day, a core structural grudge remains firmly in place. One of our sources perfectly summed up this insanely complex geopolitical web with a chillingly pragmatic realization. They said, "That's not the ending anyone wanted, but it's the ending we're getting." It's a really sobering reminder, isn't it? In geopolitics, the most likely outcome is rarely the ideal one. It's almost always just the one that requires the least amount of political sacrifice. So, we've broken down the structural data, the historical parallels, and the severe, real-world impacts on oil instability. Now, we're turning it over to you. Looking at these 5 very distinct paths, which scenario do you think is actually going to play out? Are we looking at a diplomatic miracle, a permanent freeze, or a dramatic escalation? Drop your analytical take in the comments below. Thanks for exploring this complex web with us on today's Explainer, and we'll see you in the next one.